Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Ketogenic Nutritionist Podcast. I'm your host and registered dietitian, Temple Stewart. I specialize in helping women lose weight using low carb and ketogenic diets, but I have a huge passion for all things metabolic health. We're going to talk about everything from sleep to stress to red light therapy and saunas. You name it, we'll talk about it on this podcast. So let's dive in, and thank you for being here. Don't forget to like, share, follow, and subscribe to help stay in the know. Hey guys, it's Temple Stewart, host of the Ketogenic Nutritionist Podcast. I'm super excited about today's podcast. It's so fun to talk about this topic, and this topic has been trending on socials for quite some time now. It's very popular. I'm seeing reels made about it every single day, but I have noticed that there is quite a bit of misinformation surrounding this. And that's painful for me to see because then I see people try to fix this and heal this, and they end up worse off than they were before, and or they create more problems for themselves. And so let's just go ahead and dive in. Today's topic is going to be all about cortisol. It's going to be about your adrenal glands. It's going to be about the HPA axis and all of the different things that impact your weight when you are really, really stressed out. And stress has such a profound impact on our body and our health. I cannot overstate it because it is one of those things that people really push off to the side until they're really, really struggling. And oftentimes it's one of the last things that people will address when it comes to their health. And so this podcast is going to go through what cortisol is, why we need it, why the HPA axis is so important. And then I'm going to give you guys a lot of practical application. So make sure you stay all the way until the end, because that's where you're going to find all your action steps, really, truly how to heal your adrenals and heal your cortisol levels, keep them regulated, so on and so forth, long term. So what is cortisol and why does it matter? So let's demystify this a little bit. Cortisol, often referred to as the stress hormone, it is the stress hormone. It's a steroid hormone produced by the adrenal glands. These adrenal glands are located on the top of each of your kidney. But I want you to understand cortisol plays so many other roles than just stress. It's super important for the body. And so when you see these reels that people are like, lower your cortisol, that's not always what we want. Sometimes we actually want higher cortisol, or we're in kind of the lower. So what is cortisol? Cortisol is a stress hormone. It's a steroid hormone produced by the adrenal glands. These are located on top of each of your kidneys. And cortisol plays a role in your response to stress and helps regulate several of the body's processes. We jokingly call it the stress hormone because it really is, but it has a lot of different actions in the body. So let's talk about the stress response first. So cortisol is released in response to any stress. This could be physical stress, this could be emotional stress, this could be psychological stress. It essentially helps your body cope with these stressful situations by mobilizing energy reserves. So when I say energy reserves, I'm talking your fat storage, your glucose, etc. It does this by increasing heart rate and blood pressure, and will help sharpening cognitive function as well. So think about like your fight or flight state. When you're in that state, you can think some of these stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, norepinephrine, etc., all play a role in quote unquote that fight or flight. The second thing that cortisol does in the body is it really, really helps with your metabolism regulation. Cortisol influences metabolism essentially by regulating the glucose metabolism. And it also does something called gluconeogenesis. Gluconeogenesis in the liver is a process that creates glucose from non-carbohydrate sources. So this could be proteins, this could be amino acids, this could be fats, etc. It essentially ensures a steady supply of energy during that time of stress or that time of fasting. Now, this is obviously survival, but you could see where this could create a problem because it plays such a role in regulating glucose. When you're really chronically stressed out, you're always running at high glucose, and your cortisol is using things like your muscles and your proteins and your amino acids to create glucose, which is a problem, especially if you're chronically stressed out, because you don't want to be breaking down amino acids. You don't want to be breaking down proteins, etc. So that is one of the biggest ways that it does contribute to weight. We're going to talk about that in a bit, but just keep in mind that it is able to create glucose from non-carbohydrate sources. This is why sometimes I'll have people that are following a low-carb ketogenic diet and somehow their blood glucose is still remaining pretty high. And so now I'm not saying that's the only reason, but that is definitely one of them. Cortisol also plays a big role in immune function. So cortisol has highly anti-inflammatory properties that will suppress the immune system. This can be beneficial short term, like if you are stressed or you have an injury or something, it will dampen that inflammation. But chronic elevation of cortisol will really, really weaken your immune system over time. This is why we see things like stress causing autoimmune disease long term and other diseases long term, because you do not want your immune system suppressed for a long period of time. It has a role in blood sugar and blood pressure regulation. We talked about that earlier. It regulates blood pressure by increasing sensitivity of blood vessels to the other hormones like adrenaline, epinephrine, norepinephrine. This will eventually lead to vasoconstriction, which essentially will raise blood pressure. So this is oftentimes something I see in people with chronic blood pressure issues as well, is stress will exacerbate those quite a bit. Cortisol also plays a role in mood and emotional well-being. Acute increases in cortisol during stressful situations will help enhance like alertness and focus. But if you're chronically elevating your cortisol, this can eventually lead to anxiety and depression. Cortisol also plays a role in your sleep and wake cycle. Cortisol follows a binaural rhythm, which basically means it peaks early morning to help you wake up, and then it gradually declines throughout the day. So chronic stress will cause disruptions in cortisol and really start messing with your sleep patterns. These are the people that I'll see that have low to no cortisol in the morning and have very, very high cortisol in the evening to afternoon. So those are some of the different functions that cortisol plays and has in the body. There are more than this, but I wanted you to just really understand the main ones. So what dysregulates cortisol? I'm going to go through a couple, and then I'm going to really talk about ones that I see frequently causing dysregulated cortisol. Obviously, chronic stress. So when you're exposed to physical, emotional, psychological stress, this will eventually lead to dysregulation of your HPA axis. This hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis is responsible for cortisol production. And so that is like kind of the root cause problem when you talk about cortisol issues, is we're seeing chronically elevated cortisol because this HPA axis is messed up. And we're going to talk about that in a bit as well. So chronic stress. Now, when I say chronic stress, I don't want you guys to overcomplicate it. I'm talking about caregiving. I'm talking about a job that you hate. I'm talking about maybe a strained relationship with someone in your family or your spouse. I'm talking about having a newborn baby and being up all night and caregiving all day. I'm talking any situation. Maybe it's even a traumatic event. Maybe you had something criminal happen to you, or you lost your job, or you had to file for bankruptcy, or whatever the case may be. Any trauma event or chronic stress event can mess with cortisol. And so it may even not be something quite as serious as some of those examples. Maybe you just feel really pressured as, you know, an individual performing in whatever, in school or med school or something like that. And it's nothing that you can pinpoint, but you definitely notice an elevation in your anxiety and stress levels. Sleep disruptions will also cause issues with cortisol. So anytime you're having like poor sleep quality and or you're having inadequate sleep, this will mess with that binaural rhythm of cortisol secretion. When I was telling you about, it will cause things like your cortisol to be too low in the morning, too high in the evening. I see this frequently with people that do shift work. So, you know, policemen, firefighters, nurses, doctors, people that are having to do the opposite of what their circadian rhythm wants them to do, oftentimes will cause some of this cortisol disruptions long term. Dietary factors will also play a huge role in cortisol dysregulation. The biggest one by a long shot is high sugar intake. I see this quite frequently. High fructose corn syrup, high processed carbohydrates, poor dietary quality, just high blood sugar and high sugar consumption long term. Also, nutritional deficiencies will cause cortisol dysregulation. So magnesium is a big one, vitamin C, but really all your vitamins and minerals can lead to some sort of dysregulation if left long term. Low calorie diets, specifically for long periods of time, crash dieting, prolonged periods of this low calorie consumption will elevate cortisol. This is perceived as stress, guys. When you eat low calorie, it triggers the release of cortisol because you're trying to mobilize some of those energy reserves like I was talking about. High sugar diets, we already mentioned that one. Sometimes caffeine consumption will cause some problems. Now, typically the sensitivity to caffeine is seen like it's not necessarily the root cause of cortisol dysregulation, but it certainly exacerbates it. I'm not saying moderate caffeine or mild caffeine intake will cause a problem. I'm talking like high consumption of caffeine. Oftentimes people are doing this on a fasted stomach, etc. That will really wreck your cortisol levels long term. Caffeine does stimulate the release of cortisol from the adrenal glands, and it's specifically true for those who are sensitive to caffeine or really consume it in large amounts. Some more dietary problems that will cause dysregulated cortisol, obviously alcohol consumption. Alcohol messes with everything. Fasting and intermittent fasting, if done incorrectly, can cause some cortisol issues long term. This is why I'm such a fan of just really having a strategic plan when it comes to intermittent fasting, and maybe even not even doing too much, or just making sure you feel good while you're doing it. I already mentioned inadequate micronutrient intake, but even nutritional deficiencies, B vitamins and things of that nature will cause some problems. Erratic eating patterns. So if you're like all over the place, irregular meal timing, you're frequently skipping meals. I'm not saying strategic meal skipping for fasting. I'm saying just like you're kind of all over the place when it comes to eating. That will cause some hormonal issues with cortisol as well. So those are kind of all for the dietary side of things. Let's talk about exercise and cortisol. Now, I want to really make the disclaimer that exercise in general is extremely beneficial for cortisol and every other hormone in the body. So please do not take this as me saying exercise is bad for your hormones, because that is absolutely not what I'm saying. I'm saying that if you aren't wise about the way that you exercise, and if you do not give yourself enough rest days, and you're overtraining and doing HIIT workouts all of the time, you will cause yourself some problems. I will see this too in people that are doing like, ultra marathons and are long distance swimming or something like that, without properly fueling or doing recovery strategies, will oftentimes have some issues with cortisol. This show is brought to you by my personal favorite electrolyte brand, Element. Element has tons of different flavors that all taste great, and they help energize me throughout the day. You need electrolytes for basically every body function that you have going on. So it is silly not to make sure your electrolytes aren't on point. I love Element's electrolytes, not only because they taste great, because they have the perfect ratio of all the different electrolytes your body needs. Give Element a try and see the link in the show notes for your special code. So the other thing too, I guess I could mention this in physical activity, is in extreme environmental conditions. So like if you get really, really hot, I live in Phoenix, so this is a real reality for me, and or cold. That can also sometimes cause some issues with cortisol. Of course, there are medical conditions like Cushing's, Addison's, pituitary disorders. Any of those will cause some issues with cortisol dysregulation. Also medications. So there's several medications that can cause some problems. Most of these are used to treat inflammatory conditions, but there are some medications and substances that will cause some problems long term. Obviously, corticosteroids. So prednisone, dexamethasone, hydrocortisone, all synthetic versions of cortisol, if you're on these long term, even sometimes short term, will suppress your natural adrenal production of cortisol. Long-term use of these can really, really result in adrenal insufficiency and long-term cortisol issues. Birth control pills are my second one. A lot of people have no idea that this can potentially cause problems with your HPA axis, but it's not fully understood the exact mechanism as why, but we do know birth control pills can be problem. SSRIs, sertralines, a lot of things of that nature, they can alter some of the cortisol secretion patterns. Decongestants, pseudoephedrine, definitely didn't pronounce that right. Benadryl, there you go, can essentially cause some transient increases in cortisol as well, specifically if you're having to be on these for long term. It can make it worse. Stimulants, so think, Vyvanse, Adderall, some of the things that are used to treat ADHD can affect cortisol. Weight loss supplements, especially the ones that contain like a lot of caffeine or ephedra, phentermine, things of that nature, can potentially dysregulate some things. And even some herbal supplements. So one that's real big is licorice root extract. That can cause some issues. Its enzyme actually converts cortisol to its inactive form, cortisone, if you're on it long term. So just understand some medications and supplements. Obviously, psychological factors, mental health issues, anxiety, depression, PTSD can impact it. And then environmental factors. So if you're exposed to pollution, air pollution is particularly bad for this. There's all kinds of particulate matter, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, ozone. All of that can trigger oxidative stress, noise pollution, chemical toxins, chemicals, pesticides, heavy metals, house pollutants, BPAs, phthalates, all that kind of stuff, heavy metals, pharmaceuticals in our water, tap water can be particularly bad. And then EMF, so electromagnetic fields, these are going to be from your phones, your power lines, any wireless communication. And then light pollution. So a lot of people don't know what light pollution is, but light pollution is essentially lights being on when they shouldn't be, and that can alter your circadian rhythms. So think street lights at night, outdoor advertising, if you're in a casino at 1 a.m, all of that will mess with your natural circadian rhythm, which potentially impacts cortisol. Now, the way that light pollution affects cortisol is one, it suppresses melatonin. So this is why I'm so pushy about sleep health, because when you're sitting there staring at your phone, the blue light emitted by electronic screens, LED lights, your iPad suppresses the production of melatonin. A lot of people are like, Temple, I have no idea why I'm sleeping at night. Well, it's because you're staring at your phone watching TikToks until you lay your head down. And so when melatonin secretes, which is normally towards the evening and in the night, this is a response to darkness when your eyes are not seeing that blue light, that light. And so if you're constantly exposing your eyes to blue light, you're never going to have enough melatonin secretion. And so it will inhibit that melatonin synthesis and cause some problems long term with your sleep cycle. And then, of course, the light pollution activates that stress response. It sends that HPA axis a signal to kind of get moving and can really activate the stress response at night. And then, of course, we know metabolic effects. So dysregulated cortisol from this dysregulation in circadian rhythms at night will absolutely increase your risk of every metabolic disease we have: obesity, diabetes, dyslipidemia, all of it. So those are some of the causes of cortisol dysregulation. Urban living is another one I didn't talk about. That's just being, very high population density, traffic congestion, noise pollution, all that kind of stuff. A lot of times people that go through natural disasters, whether it's a hurricane, loss of property, stuff like that, any traumatic event and or stressful event will cause some problems. Some people do have genetic predisposition to cortisol problems as well, depending on, your family. And then hormonal changes can do some things too. Puberty, pregnancy, menopause can all impact cortisol regulation. And so just be aware of that too. Cortisol's influence on weight regulation, and probably the reason why a lot of you are listening in, is cortisol is so important when it comes to weight change and keeping our weight where we want it. Cortisol just doesn't respond to stress. It influences our metabolism, our appetite, our fat storage, like we said above. So let's kind of go through some of the mechanisms which it does this. We already talked about cortisol and metabolism regulation. It influences metabolism by regulating that glucose and that gluconeogenesis, like we talked about. During times of stress, cortisol essentially signals the liver to release glucose into the bloodstream to provide that energy source. This is a response to stress, but this elevation in blood glucose leads to increased insulin secretion, which promotes fat storage, essentially promotes visceral fat storage as well, which is that fat around our organs. Cortisol will also promote the storage of fat in that visceral spot that I was talking about, but it will do it for a long period of time. And it will lead to this like preferential deposition of fat in the visceral region, like I just keep mentioning. And it's essentially causes central obesity or belly fat. So visceral fat and belly fat is much more metabolically active than your sub-Q fat or the fat around your arms, etc. So when you increase this visceral fat, you definitely increase your risk of metabolic disorders, type 2 diabetes, etc. Cortisol also has a very tight control over appetite regulation. So cortisol will influence your appetite and food intake by affecting the central nervous system and hormonal signaling pathways. Chronic stress and elevated cortisol have been associated with this appetite regulation, specifically increasing cravings for high calorie, high salt, high sugar, comfort foods, essentially, particularly those ones high in sugar and fat. And so this like quote unquote stress eating behavior will cause problems long term. You'll also lose quite a bit of muscle. So in addition to promoting fat storage, cortisol, when it's dysregulated, will also lead to muscle mass loss or muscle wasting. It's very catabolic when it comes to protein metabolism, which means breaking down. Cortisol stimulates this breakdown of muscle tissue to get those amino acids out for gluconeogenesis. And so you're breaking down muscle and storing fat at the same time, which is like a recipe for absolute disaster. And so when you lose lean muscle mass, this obviously lowers your basal metabolic rate. It decreases your overall energy expenditure, and of course will lead to weight gain. And then lastly, and one of my favorite topics, but cortisol will lead to insulin resistance. We know this because chronic elevation of cortisol is directly associated with insulin resistance. When you're pumping out glucose, you're going to have that problem. The cells become way less responsive to insulin, that it leads to impaired glucose uptake and metabolism. And it causes insulin resistance. We know insulin resistance promotes fat storage and inhibits fat breakdown, very similar to the effects of cortisol. And so it's just kind of this double whammy of problems. And that's essentially the biggest reason that it affects your weight. And I should say reasons, because there's several several there, and you can see it's really, really working hard against you. So let's go back a bit and rewind and kind of understand like where in this trail of things is cortisol getting messed up in the brain, essentially. So I've mentioned the HPA axis several times. And so it's very important to understand, yes, cortisol has its ties into weight gains, but we need to understand the other relationship that cortisol plays with other big hormones in the endocrine system that lead to weight gain, such as insulin, leptin, and ghrelin. And so in a simple way to put it, let me tell you how the HPA axis works. So number one, there's a trigger. So this is the process where your brain senses stress. This could be anything from a sudden scare to ongoing worries about your relationship or work or whatever. Your brain's control center, which we call the hypothalamus, detects this signal. From this signal, your hypothalamus is activated. Once the hypothalamus is activated, it releases corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH. CRH is essentially a messenger that tells your body, hey, we're under stress here. Let's start to panic. We need to start getting ready to deal with it. So this corticotropin releasing hormone then travels to your pituitary gland. The pituitary gland it's essentially the master regulator in your brain. The pituitary gland responds by releasing another hormone called adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. This hormone is a messenger. It delivers this stress signal all the way to your adrenal glands. Your adrenal glands sit on top of your kidneys. These kidneys are the stress responders. When they receive this signal, they start pumping out cortisol. Cortisol is then like your body's built-in alarm system, and it prepares you to face stressors head on. So cortisol floods the bloodstream, triggering this cascade of physiological changes, increasing your heart rate, boosting your energy levels, sharpening your focus, all in preparation to deal with this quote unquote perceived threat that may or may not be a threat. And then there's the feedback loop. So once this stressor has passed, your body activates a feedback loop to shut down the stress response. Cortisol levels begin to drop. This signals the hypothalamus and pituitary gland that it's time to calm down. This feedback loop helps maintain your body's stress response system, preventing cortisol levels from remaining elevated too long. But you can see with this feedback loop system, it can go haywire. And if you're under chronic stress, your body's going to understand that. And that's where essentially this feedback loop gets broken, and you're constantly releasing cortisol when you don't necessarily need to be. And so kind of going back to understanding how that, when that gets broken, you can see how cortisol has this kind of profound effect down the line. So you're stressed out, you start to stress eat, you start having cravings, for high sugary, high fat foods. Your brain then is picking up on, okay, these high sugar, high fat foods act on my reward centers of the brain. This continues this craving down the line. We're now emotional, and now you're having impulse control, and now you're dealing with sleep and coping mechanisms, and all this other stuff just really causes a huge, huge problem long term. So how do we fix it? And I know this is probably your favorite part. So we're going to go through several different things on how do we fix it. We're going to start with nutritional interventions. I'm a dietitian. This is my favorite thing to talk about. So understand, number one, that nutrition plays a massive role in cortisol regulation and weight management. It is one of the first things you can do if you start to realize, hey, my cortisol is getting out of whack. Let me make some changes when it comes to my dietary interventions to fix it. So number one, let's talk with balanced meals. So I really want to encourage you to choose protein and choose lots of non-starchy vegetables. This really helps stabilize blood sugar levels and prevents those large fluctuations that can trigger cortisol. So one of the biggest causes of and/or side effects of cortisol dysregulation is blood sugar imbalances. You'll see this with your blood sugar spiking, going low. A lot of people with cortisol issues have insulin resistant issues. So it's very crucial for people with cortisol to keep blood glucose very, very stable. It's very hard to control cortisol if your blood glucose is up and down and all around and constantly dive bombing and, constantly going really, really high. And so when you eat healthy meals full of protein, fat, and non-starchy vegetables, this helps keep your blood glucose extremely stable. The second thing I would say is really be cautious with your meal timing. Make sure that you are eating regular meal patterns and don't skip a lot of meals. I think you can get away with some mild intermittent fasting, but what I would say do is definitely don't skip breakfast. Really, if you want to incorporate some intermittent fasting, pull dinner up early. And I definitely would not recommend doing that every single day. So you still have your breakfast, you still have your lunch, and then you can have a mild intermittent fasting interval in the evening. And so pull that dinner up really early and do it that way versus trying to skip breakfast in the morning. Obviously, limit sugary foods and refined carbohydrates. We've kind of hit this one on the head. That's going to cause blood glucose issues and lead to cortisol secretion. So sugary beverages, processed foods, sugary snacks, all of that can cause lots of problems. Fiber-rich foods are really helpful. This is why I'm such a fan of vegetables, because they really help stabilize blood sugar and promote that gradual release of glucose in the bloodstream, but instead of that extremely high spike. I think moderate caffeine intake is important. I think this can be helpful so that you're not just consuming caffeine all day, even cutting your appetite and skipping meals. I think switching from coffee to green tea or from coffee to mushroom coffee can be helpful. I don't think you necessarily have to give coffee up completely. I really just think that you need to be cautious with it. Staying hydrated. And let me just emphasize this one a lot. Water is not hydration. Okay. Water is helpful for hydration, but water is not what keeps you hydrated. Minerals are what keeps you hydrated. So it is very important to have electrolytes, and I'll send you guys my favorite electrolytes that will be in the show notes. That is from Element. I use Element every single day. Making sure you're getting the right electrolytes is critical for cortisol regulation. Incorporate some stress reducing foods. And I say stress reducing, really, I just mean anti-inflammatory foods. So we're talking about foods that are very high in omega-3 fatty acids, salmon, sardines, leafy greens are very rich in magnesium. So spinach, kale, anything like that. And then antioxidant rich foods like low glycemic berries, dark chocolate, green tea, all of these anti-inflammatory foods will really help reduce stress and or help your body respond correctly. I also think it's important to note that mindful eating can be really helpful. Getting away from the TV, put your phone down, take some time to really eat, digest your meal, focus on what you're eating, the textures, your hunger cues, savoring every bite. All of that can be really helpful for your eating experience, especially if you find yourself having a lot of the cravings and things of that nature. When it comes to exercise and cortisol, remember I said earlier, I think exercise is really critical for having a healthy cortisol response and adrenal and HPA axis response. You just don't want to do too much. So I encourage people having a regular exercise routine that includes some sort of mix of aerobic exercise, strength training, and flexibility exercises. The kind of given recommendations are 150 minutes a week of moderate intensity aerobic exercises. So just think about that. My personal favorite kind of exercise routine is I usually do 2 or 3 days of strength, 2 or 3 days of walking, and then a day or so of flexibility or mobility or something like that. You definitely do not want to overtrain. If you overtrain, this will definitely lead to chronic elevated cortisol levels and obviously other negative health effects as well. So, excessive exercise volume, intensity, frequency, making sure you're giving yourself a rest day, making sure you're sleeping and eating and doing maybe even some of the relaxation techniques like yoga or mindfulness meditations, prayer, whatever it is for you can be helpful for relaxing as well. And then listening to your body. When it comes to physical activity and cortisol levels, if you're exhausted but you're forcing it, please listen to your body, pay attention to how your body responds to exercise, and adjust your workout intensity alongside that. If you're feeling fatigued or you're like experiencing some of those signs of excessive stress, consider scaling back on your workout and or routine. Like just pull it back. Hey guys, I just want to take a second to tell you about my personal favorite collagen brand. I use Equip Collagen. I even use some of their protein powders as well. This is my favorite collagen because it's such high quality. It's from grass-fed beef and it doesn't contain anything weird. No artificial dyes, sweeteners, anything that you don't want in your collagen, Equip has gotten rid of. It's an extra way to get an increase in protein and taste delicious. See the show notes for your special discount for only my podcast listeners. Can't wait to hear how you like it. And I mentioned some of these symptoms. I should have mentioned this at the beginning of the podcast, but what are some of the symptoms of cortisol dysregulation? How do you know if you potentially have this? So some of my kind of go-tos is obviously feeling overwhelmed. If you're, feeling tired all the time, even if you're getting plenty of sleep, if you have taking a long time to heal, or you have frequent infections, that can be a common one. A lot of people will report things with mental health like poor memory, brain fog, reduced productivity, like problems making decisions. A lot of people have very low sex drives, very low ability to handle any stress. They'll oftentimes have low blood sugar, feeling hangry, and intolerance to exercise. A lot of times, adrenal dysfunction will look like low blood pressure, feeling faint or dizzy when you're standing up. A lot of people will have this just absolute dependency on caffeine. They're having to drink caffeine all day to keep going. I already mentioned the cravings for salty foods and things of that nature, but those are just some of the things that we see when we see people with adrenal dysfunction. A lot of times too, you will have purple stretch marks. You'll have more of a moon face, a rounded face where it just doesn't, it looks a little bit more round than normal, tired but wired, heart palpitations, people who retain a lot of water, headaches, migraines can all be linked to cortisol problems. And so you can see there's a lot of symptoms there. I think one of the best ways to check is one, just do a symptom checklist. Are you getting a lot of these symptoms? Are you just having a really hard time keeping up? That can be definitely linked to adrenal dysfunction. So how do you test for it is another topic that we will talk about as well. But really there's two ways. There's three ways really. You can get your blood tested, which a lot of the doctors will test this fasted in the morning. The conventional medicine ranges will let you get up pretty high. I like to see this number between 12 and 15. I think any higher, you're a little bit too high. And then any lower, you're kind of not getting enough. You're not getting enough to wake up, etc. So this would be fasted in the morning. I think really one of the best tests for this is the Dutch test. I think the saliva cortisol test is really the best you'll get because it's instead of a picture, like the blood values, the Dutch test is like a saliva test throughout the day. And there's other companies, like I know Thorne has a good saliva cortisol test as well, if you didn't necessarily have the budget for Dutch testing. And so there's a lot of options out there, but I think saliva cortisol testing can be helpful. And it's like a video throughout the day because you're spitting into tubes throughout the day. So you get more of an accurate picture, an accurate line of what your cortisol should be higher in the morning and then dipping down normally throughout the day. So those are the testing options. Just keep in mind, blood testing isn't always accurate. Really gold standard is going to be saliva there. So sorry for that little brief symptoms and testing kind of plug, but let's get back to some of the other things that you can do to help your adrenals. We've talked about nutrition. We've talked about physical activity. Let's talk about supplementation. So I'm a real big fan of using some supplements to help your adrenals and your cortisol stay regulated. Now, understand supplements aren't the magic key to everything, but they can be very, very helpful when it comes to addressing this. So when I'm talking about supplements, let's go over some of those for help healing some adrenal problems. One, I like several herbs. So I think chaste tree, lion's mane, maca, rhodiola, and ashwagandha can all be pretty helpful when it comes to healing cortisol and adrenals. I think some of your basic nutrients, like your B complexes, vitamin C, vitamin E, just making sure sometimes it can be helpful just to get a good multivitamin there. Some other ones that people don't talk about a lot too would be NAC. That can be a helpful one. Manganese, glycine, fulvic acid. Those can all be pretty decent. If you have low vitamin D, obviously that requires supplement lab values, but you really want your vitamin D in the 60 to 80 range. You don't want the standard reference range of 30 to 100. That's trash. You really want optimal 60 to 80. So that can be helpful. I think some other supplements can be helpful with, blood glucose regulation, like berberine, or if you're appropriate, potentially inositol. It kind of really just depends on what your symptoms are. Adaptogens help a lot with energy, focus, things of that nature. One other thing I wanted to mention is that your thyroid is very crucial when it comes to helping with your cortisol levels. And so if you aren't having your thyroid tested or getting a full panel done, it is very critical to make sure that your thyroid is optimally functioning. And we know the standard reference range for optimal is often very, very wildly off. And so understanding what the optimal reference range is there for your thyroid and getting that under control can be very helpful as well. Sometimes too, people with adrenal issues or they're having a lot of inflammation struggle with digestion. And so digestive enzymes, if that's you, can be helpful too. So just be mindful there. You're going to have to kind of know your stuff when it comes to that if you're having issues with digestion, but understand that can be one thing that can be potentially helpful as well. Okay, and to sum up the podcast, I wanted to talk about some other potential root causes of some of the things that symptoms you may be thinking or cortisol, but maybe something different. And so I want to just throw these out there just in case some of you are potentially experiencing these and aren't aware of it. So again, thyroid hormone imbalance can sometimes cause a lot of the same issues that cortisol issues cause. And so making sure your thyroid is on point is important. Mold can be a potential issues as well. So if you aren't sure that you are in a clean home or work environment, etc., and you may get tested for mold, activating certain viruses like Epstein-Barr can cause some of the same brain foggish feelings, etc. Reducing your toxic load can potentially help quite a bit with all of this, is making sure you're using clean makeup and clean products and things of that nature can relieve some of these as well. And so just making sure you're living a clean life and understanding that everything you put on your body, you breathe in, you listen to, et cetera, can have effect on that is really, really critical and important. And so this is going to conclude my podcast episode on cortisol. If you have questions or anything about this, you can find me on every platform at the.ketogenic.nutritionist. Please drop your questions below in the comment section. Subscribe, like, and follow for more information on hormones and weight loss. And just understand that I am here to help, and I look forward to meeting you. Okay, guys, I hope you loved that episode. Thank you so much for being a part of the Ketogenic Nutritionist podcast. Don't hesitate to reach out to me on any platform, TikTok, Spotify, Instagram, at the.ketogenic.nutritionist, and tell me what you guys want to hear next. I so appreciate you being here. I could not do this without you. Talk soon.